The majority always fails at building wealth, and the reason is almost insultingly simple. They are doing exactly what everyone around them is doing, and that sameness is the infection. The Bible diagnosed it thousands of years before social media gave it a global distribution system. By the end of this lesson, you will encounter a revelation so precise and so quietly devastating that the way you see money will be permanently altered. Most people who hear about lifestyle creep assume they are immune to it. You probably know someone who leased a car that stretches his budget past what is reasonable, or a colleague who looks polished and put together at work while carrying a credit card balance that would make your stomach turn. And you watch those situations from a comfortable distance, with the quiet confidence that you are operating differently. The problem with that confidence is that it was exactly what those people felt too, right up until the moment the real numbers surfaced and told a completely different story than the one they had been living. Lifestyle creep is a structural failure, not a moral one. It is the invisible mechanism by which rising income is immediately and efficiently converted into rising expenses, so that no matter how much more a person earns across their lifetime, the gap between what comes in and what is actually kept hovers near zero for decades. And because everyone in your environment operates the same way, it never registers as a problem. It feels like adulthood. It feels like responsible participation in modern life. You look successful, you look stable, you look like you have arrived somewhere real, and that appearance is the entire trap because you are constructing the image of arrival while drifting steadily in the wrong direction. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 verse 10 says, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income." This is a clinical observation about the architecture of a mind organized around consumption. A mind that measures progress by what it displays will always require more to display, because there is no natural ceiling built into that system and no satisfaction point that holds. There is only the next purchase, the next upgrade, the next version of the same interior emptiness, wearing a newer and slightly more expensive exterior. This is the wide path, and the wide path does not end anywhere worth going. Stop and ask yourself something you may not have genuinely asked before. How many of the financial decisions you made across the last 3 years came from a clear internal framework that you consciously built? And how many were reactions, shaped by someone's driveway or a screen, or an algorithm that was specifically engineered to make what you currently have feel like a deficiency? If you sit with that question honestly, the number of truly independent decisions is probably smaller than you want it to be. The illusion of normalcy is one of the most destructive forces in financial life because it disguises pure conformity as common sense. When millions of people across different countries and income levels and backgrounds all arrive at the same financial behaviors, those behaviors start to feel like wisdom, like the answer that rational people eventually reach. They are not wisdom. They are the most popular set of answers available, and popular answers in finance have a long, consistent, well-documented track record of producing lives that look adequate from the outside while feeling structurally fragile from the inside, particularly the moment any real pressure arrives. What the crowd genuinely cannot tell you, because it does not know, is that it functions as a pressure system rather than a truth-telling mechanism. It rewards visibility and remains entirely silent about restraint. You could make a disciplined financial decision today that costs you nothing in appearance but compounds meaningfully over the next decade, and the crowd will register nothing. The social feedback loop only activates when there is something to see, something to compare, something that signals where you stand in the hierarchy of consumption. That means following the crowd's approval signals will reliably cost you everything that happens below the surface where actual wealth is built. Proverbs chapter 14 verse 12 says, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death." The language is deliberate and severe, and it deserves to land with its full weight when applied to financial life. Think about what that path actually looks like across a real career. Someone earns a reasonable income for 40 years, spends it consistently to maintain a respectable appearance, carries the debt load that modern life normalizes, and arrives at the end with almost nothing to show for 4 decades of disciplined work attendance. That person never made a single reckless, illegal, or obviously catastrophic decision. They were obedient to the culture's instructions at every step, and the culture, when the bill finally comes due at the end, offers them nothing in return for that loyalty. The financed vehicle is probably the sharpest illustration of this mechanism because it makes the financial destruction feel so reasonable at each individual step. You are making monthly payments that fall within what a calculator would call affordable. You are doing what responsible people do. You needed transportation, you acquired it through standard channels. You are meeting your obligations. What you cannot feel in the moment is that you are feeding income. Income with real compounding potential. Income that represents years of your time. Into an asset that depreciates on a fixed, predictable schedule, while the payment schedule runs with perfect consistency in the opposite direction. The crowd's silence on this reads as endorsement, which is how the mechanism sustains itself across generations. The Bible records no sympathy for willful blindness. It simply records where it leads. So here is where I want you to actually pause, because very few people sit with an honest picture of the gap between where they genuinely stand financially and where they appear to stand. If that gap is wider than you are comfortable admitting right now, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Because this message is reaching people in places the crowd never expected ancient wisdom to land, and I want to know where you are. King Solomon was the wealthiest individual in the ancient record, and his path there was never about doing what the people around him were doing. It was built on a principle he articulated so simply that most people read past it without grasping what it actually costs to practice. Proverbs chapter 21 verse 20. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. The entire architecture of financial divergence is compressed into that one verse. The wise store, not occasionally, not when it is convenient, but as a sustained discipline across the years when consumption would have been easy and socially rewarded. The fool consumes everything immediately and arrives at a completely different destination. That one decision held consistently across time produces a chasm between two lives that the crowd cannot explain when it finally becomes visible. It sounds straightforward enough to feel almost condescending, and yet the distance between understanding the principle and actually sustaining it under real social pressure is where most financial stories quietly end. Practicing restraint inside a culture of consumption is a genuinely difficult contrarian act, because the short-term reward structure runs entirely against you. You hold resources you are capable of spending, while the people around you spend everything they have and receive social celebration for it in real time. You accept a temporary appearance of having less so that something can compound beneath the surface over years. But years are a long time to hold that tension when the crowd is delivering its feedback signal daily. Most people cannot sustain it, and the reason is not weakness of character. It is that the pressure is too consistent, too sophisticated, and too socially woven into every environment they inhabit. The people who actually build wealth do one thing the masses consistently refuse to do. They get still at precisely the moments when the crowd's emotion is running highest. When prices are collapsing and the surrounding narrative is catastrophic, they examine what is being abandoned rather than abandoning it along with everyone else. When confidence is inflated and the crowd is rushing toward the same thing from every direction, they slow down and look for what is being ignored. Proverbs chapter 11 verse 24 makes the underlying logic explicit. One person gives freely and gains even more, while another withholds in the wrong direction and slides toward poverty. The counterintuitive thread runs throughout Scripture. Act when others are frozen, plant when others have already left the field, give when the crowd is tightening its grip on what it has. And then there is the media problem, which compounds everything in a very specific way. Financial media requires your anxiety to function as a business. It needs the background hum of urgency, the persistent suggestion that something is happening right now that you cannot afford to miss. Every trend it surfaces has already been populated by the crowd that moved prices before the signal reached you, which means by the time the majority receives the information and acts on it, the asymmetric window has already closed. The people who captured that window moved quietly, early, and against the direction of the crowd's emotional current. They are already positioned somewhere entirely different by the time the headline appears on your screen. If this is landing where it should, like this video right now, the algorithm needs that signal to carry this further. When the crowd panics, prices fall, and when prices fall far enough below what the underlying asset is actually worth, a window opens that most people are constitutionally incapable of stepping through. Everything in the surrounding environment is delivering the same message in the same moment. This is the worst possible time. Conditions are deteriorating. Anyone moving right now is reckless. The reason most people never act in those moments has nothing to do with the quality of their information. They have access to the same data as everyone else. What they lack is the capacity to tolerate the physical feeling of moving in the opposite direction from a crowd that is unanimous in its fear. The real skill is separating the emotional state of a market from the fundamental condition of what is being priced, understanding that fear is not a valuation, that mass panic distorts perception in predictable and temporary ways, and that the person who can read that distortion from outside the emotional field will consistently find what the crowd abandoned in its rush toward the exit. Joseph of Egypt understood this architecture before there was a vocabulary for it. In Genesis chapter 41, Joseph stood before Pharaoh and decoded a dream the entire kingdom had failed to interpret. 7 years of extraordinary agricultural abundance, followed immediately by 7 years of devastating famine. His response was not a spiritual statement or a word of comfort. It was a precise logistics proposal. Assign commissioners to collect a fifth of every harvest across the years of abundance, store it systematically in every city, build the reserve infrastructure before the crisis arrives so that when scarcity appears, it meets a prepared position rather than an empty one. Genesis chapter 41, verses 34 through 36. Appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Build the buffer before you need it. Use the abundant season to engineer a position that the lean season cannot destroy, because the lean season is always coming in some form on some timeline, and the only question is whether it arrives to find preparation or exposure. Generation after generation, the middle class runs the opposite pattern. The surplus of the good years gets absorbed into a larger lifestyle. Income rises and expenses rise to meet it within months. When the contraction arrives, and it always does, there is nothing to absorb the impact. Just exposure. And then, layered on top of the exposure, the paralysis settles in. They understand now what they should have done earlier, and they will act once conditions stabilize, once the timing is clearer, once the uncertainty resolves into something manageable. But waiting for that moment is itself an active choice. It is the decision to let compounding time accumulate against you rather than for you, and that cost runs silently, every single day that passes without action. Real financial discipline produces nothing visible in the short term. There is no social event for it, no recognition from the crowd, no feedback signal that tells you the decision was right. It is the same quiet choice made on an unremarkable Tuesday that was also made the week before and will be made again the week after, and it compounds in the dark across years into something the crowd will eventually look at and struggle to account for. Emotional discipline specifically is the refusal to let anxiety cast a deciding vote on financial decisions. The market drops. The feeling arrives, urgent and physical, demanding a response, carrying the full weight of a crowd's collective fear as amplification. The disciplined mind acknowledges the feeling fully, names it accurately for what it is, and does not obey it. That gap between the arrival of the feeling and the execution of an action is where wealth is either built or destroyed across a lifetime. For most people, that gap does not exist. The feeling arrives and the action follows immediately, and the pattern of selling when afraid and buying when euphoric and entering late and exiting early, repeated consistently across decades, produces a result that feels inexplicable but was entirely predictable from the beginning. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 32 says, "Better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city." The comparison is not casual. The Bible places emotional self-governance above military conquest on the hierarchy of meaningful human achievement. The general's victory is external and time-bounded, but the disciplined person's victory compounds internally across decades in ways that a single bad market cycle cannot undo. Consider what Isaac actually did in Genesis chapter 26. There was a famine significant enough to move people, to activate the crowd's survival logic, which in that context meant leaving the land and searching for stability somewhere more hospitable. Isaac received different instruction and made a choice that looked from the outside genuinely difficult to justify. He stayed. He planted in famine conditions, in foreign territory, with every rational environmental signal pointing toward caution, and Genesis chapter 26 verse 12 records what followed. Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. 100-fold return in the worst agricultural season in the region because he moved when the crowd had stopped moving. The structural teaching inside that account is this: the person who plants in famine is positioned to harvest when the famine breaks, and everyone else is still trying to recover from the losses they incurred by doing nothing. The asymmetric return goes to the one who acted before conditions felt safe, before the crowd gave its permission, before the outcome was visible enough to feel comfortable. The widow of Zarephath demonstrates the same principle from a completely different angle. She had her last remaining oil and flour, enough for one final meal, and when she gave it anyway at the prophet's word, 1 Kings chapter 17 verses 13 through 14 records the result. The jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry. Provision continued specifically because she moved against the logic of scarcity rather than surrendering to it. Your mind has been trained through years of crowd exposure to treat consensus as the safest available position. Examine that assumption carefully because consensus is a description of where everyone already is. It tells you nothing reliable about where things are going. When everyone agrees that something is impossible, give it serious attention. When everyone agrees that something is a guaranteed outcome, give it even more. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th century, identified something in human nature that the financial industry has since constructed an entire economy around exploiting at scale. He described the human soul as restless, perpetually reaching outward toward the acquisition that will finally produce a settled sense of completion, of having arrived, of being enough. He was writing centuries before consumerism existed as a system, which makes his diagnosis more striking, not less. He was not describing behavior that modern advertising created. He was describing the interior mechanism that makes that advertising possible. The soul that has not found its foundation in something permanent will keep searching for it in things that decay, and each acquisition accelerates the search rather than resolving it, because the feeling the purchase was supposed to generate never quite lands the way the anticipation promised. Every person who has ever taken on debt to maintain an image they feel pressure to project is living inside that exact cycle. The specific object being purchased almost never matters. What drives the decision is the feeling the object is supposed to produce, the sense of belonging to a category of people who have made it. That feeling lasts for a limited time before the object becomes ordinary, before someone else has the newer version, before the gap between where you are and where the culture says you should be reopens and demands to be closed again with the next acquisition. Augustine was diagnosing the engine of lifestyle creep 12 centuries before anyone attached that name to it, and his diagnosis has not aged even slightly. The vanity of accumulating false status is financially catastrophic because it is the precise mechanism that keeps the majority locked exactly where it is, working harder every year to maintain an appearance that costs more every year and builds nothing of lasting structural substance beneath it. Jesus said it in Matthew chapter 7 verse 13, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." This is a description of how reality is actually structured across virtually every domain, and in financial life, it maps with uncomfortable precision. The broad road requires nothing unusual from you. It asks only that you continue doing what everyone around you is doing, accepting the frameworks you were handed, spending and borrowing and performing within the parameters the culture considers normal. The narrow road requires that you leave behind what the majority has accepted as the default. Their spending logic, their definition of what success looks like from the outside, their timeline for when building something actually begins. The people who arrive at genuine financial freedom, the kind that does not require a favorable market condition or a neighbor's opinion to remain intact. They did not access principles the majority had never encountered. The scripture was always available. The examples were always there. What separated them was the sustained willingness to implement what the majority found too uncomfortable to maintain past the initial enthusiasm of having heard it. So stop performing wealth and build it instead. The compound effect is completely indifferent to the badge on your vehicle or the label on your clothing. It responds only to the quiet, consistent, unglamorous decisions made on ordinary days, long after the crowd has moved on to whatever distraction comes next, by the person who chose the narrow road and stayed on it. This channel exists to walk that path with you. If this wisdom is taking root in how you think, join this community, because the next lesson does not get softer or more comfortable. It gets more precise. And precision, applied with patience across enough time, is what actually changes the trajectory of a life. May your decisions be governed by truth rather than noise, and may the peace that transcends understanding guard both your heart and your treasury.